Hey guys, 224 Big back with another reaction video, and this time we're finishing off top 20 Experiment Creepypastas by Tab's Top Videos. Last time we left off with number 11. Now we're going into number 10. So without any further ado, I'm not gonna really say anything much because I said most of it what I said in the first part in my first half of my reaction to the last video. So yeah, so let's just move on, shall we? So yeah. And last stuff was number 10. We left off at 40 minutes and 34 seconds. So yeah, without any further ado, let me move on. In 3, 2, 1, and now.
Happy Puppet Syndrome.
Oh wow.
Deep in the Alaskan forest, a hidden laboratory was discovered and an investigation launched. Abandoned, the facility had experienced much damage due to fire and the surrounding environment. Traces of blood were discovered in the ruin, as well as blockades sealing off what appeared to be an observation room. Much of the equipment and records had been burned beyond repair, but a single note had been left behind as a vague account of what happened here. A group of ambitious psychologists, having studied the human brain for many years, dared to tamper with the human genetic makeup to remove all sadness from the mind, to permanently keep someone locked in a euphoric state. They theorized such constant positivity would encourage greater learning and understanding without negative mental health holding them back. To that end, they employed the services of genetic scientists to grow children and alter them at the genetic level, a process that was left off the record so as not to be repeated, and so began the Angel Man project. But it would be a while before any positive results would be made. Half the babies died during artificial gestation, and the rest were too disfigured to survive birth. Only 3 remained, seemingly perfect and able to function like a real human being. 18 months into the trials, the first issues began to arise. Balance issues, insomnia, slow reaction times, and poor ingestion caused the team great concern. But the experiment continued. As they grew, the children developed tics and sporadic movements, as well as an incessant laughter that would not cease, no matter how much negative stimuli was used. The higher learning capabilities that were predicted from the alterations also did not occur. Ironically, the constant euphoric state made it impossible for them to comprehend or focus on what the scientists attempted to teach them. Their odd movements and warped smiles earned them the title of Happy Puppet Syndrome, since the children appeared to be mindlessly happy marionettes bouncing on their strings. By the time the experiment reached its 5th year, it was obvious that the trials were a failure, and so the children's food was laced with poison to terminate them painlessly. However, the scientist assigned to deliver their final supper froze upon entering the cell. He fell to his knees and clutched his scalp, screaming in absolute pain. The children stared, silently smiling for the first time, absolutely still, until the man collapsed. He spasmed briefly before falling limp. The isolation room was sealed off just before one of the children could escape, but as he fell into a fit of laughter, power throughout the facility was cut off, and the air was filled with the sounds of glass shattering, screams, whispers, and laughter. By the time the emergency power kicked in, only 2 scientists remained. They inspected the corpses of their colleagues, only to discover each of them laughing audibly beneath their breath. Both survivors described the feeling of being watched from the shadows by something just beyond sight. And to make matters worse, all the children had escaped.
Of course.
The remaining scientists burned the lab and fled to civilization. According to the notes, it appears that the symptoms spread with them, as cases of children falling into uncontrollable fits of laughter began popping up across the world. A cover story was created, but it would only be a matter of time before cases of the new Angel Man syndrome would grow to an extreme level. Why the only remaining member of the experiment, as far as we know, returned to the facility has yet to be determined. However, we do know that he's still running from the mistakes of his past, but it seems the past will soon catch up.
Oh boy. Number 9.
Red Moon. July 18th, 2020 saw the NASA vessel Goliath 1 begin its maiden voyage to the moon. Its mission? To survey the Serenitatum di Mare and begin preparations for mass colonization. A level field within a basin, referred to as the Sea of Serenity, Serenitatum was the perfect experimental foundation for humanity's first outer space society to build upon. Due to interference from within the basin and the secretive nature of the operation, the Goliath crew were ordered to only make radio contact when NASA's side of the Earth was facing them, when the signal would be at its strongest. Over the first few months, operations ran smoothly, as per journal and video entries sent back to Mission Control. The 6 astronauts detailed their initial setup to make the area habitable enough to be as hands-on with designing their new moon city, moving on to drawing up blueprints for a habitation zone. However, on the 17th of September, NASA failed to receive the daily update from the expedition team. An overhaul of the array indicated that both satellites were intact. However, the team themselves were failing to call or answer hails from Mission Control. Several weeks later, a second team that was sent to ascertain the fate of the original crew discovered a bloodbath, despite a clear lack of remains. With no explanation, they turned to the crew's unsent video logs for answers, with the dates lasting only 1 day after the initial loss of communication. The first video, dated for the 16th of September, the day before the base's silence, featured only 10 minutes of the team examining the Mare's border. Towards the end of the video, one of the surveyors mentioned scratching noises coming from the Bessel crater nearby, although no such audio was picked up, nor was this mentioned in their report for that day. The recording for the 17th begins with the team making notes of the area nearby the Bessel crater in the Mare's southern sector. It is here, however, that the scratching noises are picked up by the instruments and appear to interfere with equipment, angering one of the party. He attempts to investigate when an unseen entity pulls him down into the mile-deep crater, and the film cuts as he screams for dear life. The final video, labeled Code 7700, Please Help, is assumed to have been recorded on the 18th of September. One of the astronauts is taking shelter inside an oxygen tent, where he explains that 2 of the other expedition party have been brutally slaughtered, and that he has been cut off from the radio transmitter to call for help. As to the whereabouts of the remaining 3 experiment team members, he is unaware. The man cries as he attempts to both reason a way out of this situation and say his final words when the same scratching noises are heard from outside, the volume reaching extreme levels. At this moment, the camera is knocked aside and the man is heard pleading for his life before blood splatters the walls. His wails grow as what was later identified as the snapping of bone being ripped from flesh takes place. Brown liquid mixes with red, and a death rattle replaces his fearful calls. Records indicate that the 18th marked the rare phenomenon of the red moon. Since the entity of circumstances have never been completely documented or resolved, this information has never made it to the public. The single snapshot taken of whatever unknown creature that was encountered, nor the suicides of half the recovery team sent prior to the incident, have been hidden away. Any continuation of the experimental moon colonization has been postponed for humanity's foreseeable future.
Yeah, that'd be the best for everybody.
Necrosis.
I heard it.
In the
That sounds so
1980s,
familiar.
a team of scientists ventured to Africa to study and experiment on the Goonshell spores spread by the beautiful, yet toxic, blom flowers. Amongst the tribal natives outside of Kajuju, the spores caused madness and dementia, causing them to turn incredibly hostile and murder, even devour, other people, regardless of affiliation. The wounded and subsequently infected would even resort to self-harm, and despite the seriousness of the injury, would continue their rampage regardless. The scientist managed to isolate and study one of the victims, noting the clear necrotic transformation of his body paling and drying his skin and patches of green sores covering its surface. He eventually took his own life, and, upon burial, those present observed the corpse violently twitching beyond normal amounts of necrotic nerve firing. Further testing discovered the spore's ability to reproduce and regenerate cells even after the host has passed away, even morphing a person's physical appearance to become muscular and strong, especially in injured areas of the body where the spore concentrations were highest. These were marked with a red pigmentation and appear to be highly sensitive points where the Goonshell was at its strongest and most vulnerable. Patients with these patches show Wendigo psychosis, an insatiable desire to consume human flesh. One scientist, referred to as Angel, was attacked by their primary subject and terminated the hostile in self-defense. Clearly facing infection, she turned the gun on herself. The science team returned to the United States, but due to their interference and the spread of other contagious diseases such as Ebola, the now dubbed Wendigo complex assimilated and evolved into a deadly airborne pathogen, spreading across Africa, with the eventual cases popping up all over America. At first, the stories reported the violence as unusual random acts such as splayed bodies on morgue slabs trying to walk out of the door, or bizarre, gruesome murders where victims were eaten in public areas. Even with borders cut off from access, animal life spread the contagion, and soon, entire continents were facing a crisis with living dead roaming populated areas, hunting down every person they could find. Many of the world's greatest scientific minds, including the unnamed scribe of these events who was present at Ground Zero, were taken to an underground bunker by the President of the United States. For years, they searched for a cure or a method to easily retake the surface. But hope slowly faded and the facility became compromised. The President, soon devoid of all confidence in their success, simply gave himself to the creatures, and the lone scientist takes down these notes for someone, anyone, to find. For he knows all too well what will happen to him now that he has been bitten as well.
Man.
Goonshell Effect, a documentation of one of the earliest recorded experiments carried out by the Nazis after the invasion of Poland. The Goonshell Effect lasted 5 days, and records only survive in the form of translated audio diaries used as evidence in the Nuremberg trials. Doctors Victor Ubelgrens, Josef Vermin, and team leader Klaus Goonshell isolated 2 Polish men, one of their daughters, and a pregnant woman from one of the first villages to become occupied, to observe their reactions to orders from their seemingly generous captors. On the first day, each prisoner was fed roasted boar and fine wine from Germany, all of them reacting with surprise and joy. Day 2 also began cheerfully with buttermilk waffles and orange juice, bacon, eggs, and sausages. However, after midday, the 2 Polish men received knives and were ordered to kill each other. Refusal would result in their execution, and killing the other subjects would have resulted in an elongated torture process before death. They complied to the outrageous demand, and the father was murdered while his daughter listened over the intercom. Afterwards, roast stew was served for dinner containing, as Goonshell himself put it, an extra ingredient. Day 3 started with cheese croissants and dipping butter, while the mid-afternoon saw the pregnant woman entering labor. The remaining Polish man assisted by giving her an emergency C-section and was left alone in the room with her, the baby, and surgery equipment. He was then instructed to pull out the baby's heart and consume it. After a little persuasion, he pulled out one of the instruments and stabbed the newborn through the chest and extracted the still beating heart, eating it in front of the mother.
Oh my God.
He attempted to explain his actions as the corpse was removed from the room, but the damage had already been done. Still alive by daybreak, the mother was muttering to herself quietly while her face showed no emotion. Cheddarwurst was served to each prisoner, and the former mother was given her task. First, she was instructed to carve slut into her breasts. Afterwards, she was given cutlery and told to devour her own feces, all of which she performed with no discernible reaction. She continued this even after the male was instructed to and carried out, beating her to death with the frozen remains of her child. Once more, the man tried to explain his actions to the frightened girl in the other cell, attempting to detach himself from his behavior. During this trial, however, it is noted that Dr. Ubelgrenz was shot by Goonshell for the attempted murder of a guard and ending the experiment. On the 5th and final day, after taking no rest after the frightful events both subjects had been witness to, they ate French crepes before the final task. In exchange for his freedom, the male was instructed to rape the young girl in every orifice he could find. This time, he accepted with no remorse or distaste, quickly performing all instructions and leaving her very close to death. He was handed a hacksaw and told to cut her in half from the legs up. Her screams filled the room, and when silence fell, so did his sanity. The man brought the hacksaw down on his own head and severed it down the middle, an impossible feat by normal human abilities, as noted by Goonshell himself. The experiment was a success. Goonshell had proven that, given a well-controlled society and environment, the promise of survival and good treatment will cause regular civilians to commit the most heinous of acts. This practice may have been carried out in German-occupied territories had the doctor not been killed by one of his colleagues after the experiment's conclusion, but that hasn't stopped the theory from being put into practice elsewhere.
Tulpa. A unknown author recounted a series of shocking psychological events that occurred a year prior to the writing, resulting in experiences that became too real for his liking. He discovered an ad in the local paper advertising for test subjects in a social experiment that paid good money. All it involved was sitting in an empty room with sensors to read brain activity, all the while imagining a double of yourself called a tulpa. He immediately applied, and the test began the next day. Over the first few sessions, the author found it difficult to constantly visualize his doppelganger, but as the second week rolled around, he'd become quite the expert. The testers subjugated him to more stimuli. Loud noises and distracting sounds aimed to break his concentration, but even this was mastered in a matter of days. He became so well versed in conjuring up his alternate that the pair even began having conversations with each other, as well as interacting through rock, paper, scissors and other activities. His double allowed him to access subconscious memory, thoughts, and ideas long since lost or unobtainable. Deep personality traits and abilities of perception were now open to explore through this double. It was something he secretly decided to use outside of testing hours on dates and family friend get-togethers. By the 4-month mark, the Tulpa was now constantly present within the author's life, a fact that seemed to please the researchers. In the meantime, the author was slowly cutting himself off from the rest of the outside world, no longer being able to relate to others due to his higher perception. When one of his friends confronted him about his absence, the doppelganger pushed the author into confrontation, resulting into a bloody fight and a broken nose as well as a destroyed friendship. This was when the author became concerned at the Tulpa's ability to influence his behavior and make him lash out at even his dearest friends. The doppelganger appeared encouraging of this change, smiling gleefully and appearing somewhat more menacing than previously imagined. The physical manifestation grew worse and worse over time. Skin flaky and decaying, sharp teeth and long talon-like nails. His language became foul, and the horrible sounds from the experiment followed him wherever he went. The author channeled as much concentration as he could into erasing the Tulpa from his mind, but whenever he relaxed, it would pop back into existence only to terrorize him again. He continued going back to the testing facility, although he only pretended to summon his double there. The researchers, however, were aware of his resistance, and so forced him to undergo more tests, keeping him prisoner. They force-fed drugs into his system, encouraging hallucinations and nightmarish visions. What was worse, the Tulpa now no longer resembled a mirrored image of himself, but a tall, hunched corpse-like beast that tortured and taunted him with threats against his family and to his person. It now appeared to be able to physically harm the author, causing cuts and bruises to appear and inflict pain. Even the scientists, who ignored him the whole time, appeared to interact with the Tulpa as the days and weeks continued. As it made another threat to disembowel his sister, the Tulpa touched his forehead, smiled, and said,
"All thoughts are creative,"
before
God.
leaving the room. Not long after, the author was sedated, and when he awoke, his restraints were gone and the facility abandoned. He escaped and informed the authorities, who found no evidence, and the trail went cold. Since the events, the author has become a recluse, not leaving the house or sleeping very much. Panic attacks and nightmares plague his life, and only sometimes can he concentrate enough to make them go away. However, 3 days before publishing his story, the author attended the funeral of his sister, who was, apparently, a victim of a mass murderer who mugs then guts their victims. Despite the nice service, he couldn't shake the sound of a disjointed, unsettling melody of noises building in the distance.
Alright, now we're at number 5. 4 more.
The Chernobyl Experiment. On the 15th of July, 1997, the Soviet Union allowed a U.S. strike team to enter the highly irradiated Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Pripyat, Ukraine. There, they discovered a journal from a previous expedition that lost contact not long after entering the area, almost 6 years prior. The huge levels of radioactivity had resulted in only a partial translation, but most of the important details have been discovered. The original Russian team had been airlifted into Chernobyl with subpar equipment even for the time, but a reasonable window to complete their experiment, to research possible life forms around and within the vicinity of the power plant. Their pilot was apparently killed en route, and the helicopter crashed in the surrounding area, meaning that they could not call for an evac until they found another power source. Since civilization would mean a long trek through the wilderness in any direction, the team decided to head deeper into Chernobyl. Some ruins were covered in blood, and the atmosphere was heavy with fog. After another unsuccessful attempt to radio for help, that confirmed that they were cut off. The team set up camp for the night. Strange noises echoed in the distance, and the early effects of radiation poisoning began taking their toll. 3 days into the expedition, and food supplies were running unnaturally low. To make matters worse, one of the squad members claimed to see a small child staggering through the nearby courtyard, armless and with no eyes. The next day, almost all food and ammo had gone missing, along with one of their number. The squad set off in a search of tartar in several of the structures, only to find horrific half-child, half-spider mutations that became hostile upon contact. They attacked with incredible speed and ferociousness, cutting much of the team down. As they escaped, the survivors discovered the remains of Tartar, who hadn't made it much further than the rest. The journal writer and another soldier were ambushed soon after, and the writer locked himself inside a nearby room, but left the soldier outside with the creatures. Over the course of the next 24 hours, the writer grew weaker due to the heavy radiation levels, but did catch a glimpse at the pale, featureless monster that appeared to lead the horde, as well as several other flying creatures that must have been the cause of the helicopter crash. The final entry describes hearing gunshots from rifles unlike the AK-47s the team had brought with them. But even so, whoever it was left soon after. It was at this point that the last surviving member of the team decided that they did not want to succumb to the monsters, nor the radiation. The journal was recovered from the remains of a body outside a building near the crash site, having apparently leapt to their death from one of the upper balconies.
Hostage situation. Hostage situation follows the events experienced by Lieutenant Jeff McInnes and his SWAT team as they attempt to resolve a hostage crisis at a local hospital. They infiltrate through the basement and head upstairs, noting that doctors and mercenaries alike have been slaughtered, but not by gunfire. Large gashes and heavy impact trauma are noted amongst the trail of blood and organs they wade through to find any survivors. But the strangest thing of all is the distinct lack of patience, and it's only when they find the doctors too have taken arms against more than the enemy soldiers do they realize that there's another layer to the situation than meets the eye. Whatever it has been let loose. After a warning from one of the surviving doctors, the other team are beset by ravenous patients undergoing a hideous mutation. Their eyes caked with yellow pus and mouths dry and foaming from an unknown substance. They attack anything unlike them with significant speed and force. Cut off from the outside, the teams become divided in the ensuing chaos, and the rescue mission becomes a trial of survival. Infected groups mean a horrific death, but some individual hostiles attempt to inject a strange substance into their victims that cause a mutation to spread to others. As time passes, the infected take on an even hollower form, corpse-like with no blood running through their systems. As McInnes, his scattered team, and the lone doctor try to regroup through the horde of psychotic deformed patients, the truth behind the hospital's operation is slowly revealed. The mercenary group were employed to clean up the existence of the hospital and get a hold of any research and chemicals developed. However, when several scientists revolted knowing their fate, the ensuing violence triggered the release of the infected patients who swarmed the entire facility. However, the fail-safes did not engage, resulting in half the horde escaping and half the SWAT teams infiltrating before they activated. Either the remaining officers and doctors wait 100 days to ensure the infected have starved before the lockdown expires, or the building is imploded, leaving no trace. The doctor reveals that they were working on a serum to perfect neural immortality, preserving a person's brain even after death has occurred to save their essence. It is clear to all that the results are nowhere near what they had planned to achieve. Luckily, the escapees have been wiped out, and the survivor managed to make their way through a collapsed wall in the underground parking lot one of the SWAT teams used as an infiltration point, but not before a series of hard losses and betrayals shook their world.
gateway of the mind.
Called it. I knew it'd
In
eventually
an
be on here.
undisclosed facility, a group of scientists attempted to discover the true extent
But I have
of
to
the
say, this
brain's
has to be my
potential
most
sometime
interesting
during
one, I think.
1983. Their theory was that once all possible human senses were shut off, a person would be able to perceive the presence of God beyond the physical boundaries of creation. The only subject was an old man who volunteered based on the fact that he felt he had nothing left to live for. His senses were purged one by one. First sight, then auditory functions, taste, smell, and finally tactile perception. All that remained open to the man were the thoughts in his head and the empty void that was the world around him. Although he could not hear, he spoke aloud in near unintelligible sentences that somehow got clearer with each passing day. 4 days passed, and he claimed to hear voices whispering inside his mind, which the doctors immediately dismissed as psychosis. However, days later, he cried out that his deceased wife was communicating with him, and that he could talk back to her. Despite this, the scientists were not intrigued by the incident until the man began naming other deceased people with whom he was talking, relatives,
Oh wait, why am I even?
spouses,
I know about this story already, so.
friends that the man
It's
could
still pretty interesting
not have
and
known about before.
creepy, like all experiments.
It was at this stage of the experiment that many scientists left the project due to the disturbing turn it was taking. After another week of observation, the disembodied voices only increased in volume, resulting in the subject resorting to self-harm to drown them out. Due to the numbing of his senses, however, the man was liable to inflict life-threatening wounds, without the pain as an influential factor. After much begging, sedatives were administered to the patient over a 3-day period to induce sleep. After which, even this resort was nullified by the patient experiencing severe night terrors. Now invading his dreams, the one haven available to him, the man was slowly driven insane over the course of the next few days. He clawed at his dead eyes and claimed the voices were growing more hostile and deafening, referring to the oncoming apocalypse and the hell consuming the earth. After which the man chanted, "No heaven, no forgiveness," loudly for 5 straight hours. The scientists, not willing to stop the experiment, being so close to a breakthrough, ceased all attempts at aiding in restoring the subject's sanity. He began speaking in tongues and attempted to eat the flesh off his arms. Once restrained, he stopped screaming and simply lay on the table silently and stared at the ceiling, tears falling from his eyes. A fortnight passed with no perceived change until one of the scientists entered the chamber and was apparently fixed in the man's gaze, despite being blind. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and He has abandoned us," before losing all vital signs.
Drop dead.
No cause of death was ever discovered, and no attempts at recreating the experiment have ever been made.
Is this going to be the Russian suit experiment?
MKULTRA.
MKULTRA.
The CIA
I've
began
heard of this
experiments
before.
through their Scientific Intelligence Division to develop a way to control the minds of an individual to obey their every command. Trials began in the early 1950s with varying levels of success, beginning with the use of LSD, a well-known perception-distorting narcotic at the time. The targeted subjects were made of mental patients, addicts, and prostitutes. One person was injected with the drug for 174 days straight. When it was decided that the candidate pool was too wide to have any noticeable effect, they went ahead with Operation Midnight Climax. A series of brothels were established in the San Francisco area where the male customers were doused with the drug and studied in close quarters through one-way mirrors. When about to fraternize with the staff, they would be taken to a holding cell where they were interrogated and frightened into confessing information. While this worked for a short while, the combination of drugs and stressful situations resulted in several subjects suffering cardiac arrest or being permanently mentally traumatized from the events. LSD was, as a result, discontinued as a candidate for the mind control trials, which had seen many scientists walk away from the project due to ethical reasons. The CIA continued their search and eventually stumbled upon MKULTRA, a combination of barbiturate, a central nervous system sedative, and amphetamine, a powerful central nervous system stimulant. The records surrounding the discovery and trial phase of MKUltra were deliberately destroyed by the CIA after public outrage at the discovery of the mind control test broke out. However, some evidence remained, and modern forensic technology had pieced together the missing pieces of the last days of this experiment. Sidney Greenwood was the first person to whom MKUltra had been administered to, and the only patient to have been expressly monitored. He was injected in both arms, one with the depressant, the other the stimulant, resulting in him drifting into a half-conscious state, with both chemicals working to keep his mind at ease while still being alert enough to coerce. He was unable to talk initially, but after several questions, MKUltra took effect. The notes of Dr. Cottrell detail how the patient would babble to the air around him, though the room was empty. But after some time, they were able to get truthful answers from Sidney about his life. As the days continued, the scientist also noted how Sidney believed he was owned by the CIA, a side effect welcomed by the overseers of this experiment. However, they discovered the subject on day 4, bleeding from the eyes and frothing at the mouth. He remained in this state for another day, where it was noted that several scientists left due to experiencing severe migraines. On the 6th day, Dr. Cottrell went to check on the patient, only to find him missing, and both guards dead. He implores the reader to let the world know about MKUltra briefly before the document cuts out, now blotted with a blood stain. Further research found a list of the deceased, including a Dr. Cottrell, who was found dead at his typewriter. It was also discovered that although Sidney, with his foaming mouth and glowing red eyes, was eventually found attempting to flee the base and executed, other subjects were injected with the drug. The facility was abandoned, along with the experiments, but no trace of the patients' bodies have ever been found, even a century later. It is clear that the patients of MKUltra are still alive to this day and live among us now, waiting for their chance at revenge.
Number 1 is the Russian sleep experiment.
The Russian Sleep Experiment.
What else could it be?
After the
Most
conclusion of
famous
World War
experiment
II,
creepypasta
Russian
around.
scientists were ordered to begin experiments on expanding the limit of human capabilities in preparation for the looming Cold War and possible subsequent conflict with the West. To that end, they initiated several trials, including their own sleep experiment on several political prisoners Russia had captured over the last decade. 5 were chosen to take part in the trials and promised freedom, an agreement none of the overseers would honor. The 5 were sealed in a test chamber with a toilet and running water, cots for resting, a plethora of books, and enough dried food to last a month. The test was simple. An experimental gas would be pumped into the room, preventing sleep for a 30-day period in which the scientist would observe the reactions the prisoners had. The first week was mostly uneventful. The subject made good use of the resources given to them and discussed their lives with some of the others in the room. However, as the weekend ended, each became paranoid of their surroundings and began muttering into the microphones and one-way mirrors around the chamber, completely ignoring the others in the room and even threatening to turn them in for some reward of trust. After 9 days, one of the subjects began running from one end of the cell to the other, screaming at the top of his lungs until his vocal cords are torn through the continuous strain, now only able to gasp and choke on the air. None of the other prisoners reacted to the noise and activity, at least until the second captive began screaming. They tore pages out of the books and covered the windows by sticking them on them with their own feces. Scientists spent 2 whole days relying on the microphone system to analyze and study the experiment, but the lack of any noise at all concerned them. However, they could determine the oxygen consumption in the room was consistent with 5 full-grown humans undergoing strenuous exercise. On the 14th day, the scientists reluctantly decided to enter the chamber, but when promising that, upon their full cooperation, one of the test subjects would be immediately released, one calmly responded that they no longer wished to be freed. Confused, yet curious, the scientists entered regardless after expelling the gas. This action provoked a negative response from the subjects, only 4 of whom were still alive in a manner of speaking. They had torn the flesh in chunks over their bodies and had laid their abdominal organs on the floor around them. The body of the deceased subject had been torn asunder, limb from limb, and was being devoured by the others. None of the food rations since the first week had been touched, and the torso of the victim had been stuffed into a drain in the middle of the room, causing the running water to pool 4 inches off the floor. When soldiers attempted to remove the subjects from their confines, they killed one by ripping out his throat and mortally wounded another by opening a major artery whilst attacking his genital region. 3 others committed suicide after the events that day, and one of the scientists broke his ribs and arm whilst removing one of the more docile patients. He was injected with 10 times the recommended amount of morphine, and even then took 3 minutes to die after his heart stopped beating, all the while asking for more. 3 survived, 1 having the ripped vocal cords. One of the other 2 was taken to surgery, struggling every step of the way, very nearly breaking his restraints and escaping the grip of the 200-pound soldier. He was put under gas anesthesia, which slowed his heart rate to a crawl, making it too dangerous to commence the procedure. The subject with the torn vocal cords was silently objective to the treatment, but agreed to it when a non-anesthetic surgery was suggested. After all his organs were put in place, the doctor noticed he was trying to speak, and managed to discern the words, "keep cutting," from his dry wheezes. The first subject was taken off anesthesia, and he and the other remaining subject had the same procedure, with the doctors all the while remarking on how it was impossible for any of them to be alive. Afterwards, all 3 remaining prisoners requested they be returned to the chamber and for the gas to be turned back on. The only reason as to why was because they must remain awake. Despite failing their primary objective, the ex-KGB military advisor saw promise in the trials and the subject's resistance to pain, and so allowed for the continuation of the experiment. The general personally oversaw the operations from this point on, beginning with the monitoring of their EEG brainwaves. None of them struggled when they were told the gas would be returning soon, and so accurate readings could be acquired. The subject who had been anesthetized before surgery kept dropping into a deep sleep before waking up in short bursts until finally his heart gave out. The autopsy showed he had widespread skeletal breaks caused by the strain his muscles had on them, and his bloodstream contained 3 times as much oxygen as it should. The only subject who could speak, now also falling briefly into sleep, demanded the chamber be sealed and the gas turned back on. The general ordered the chamber closed, trapping 3 medical staff within. 1 drew a gun and shot the general through the glass between the eyes. As the 2 members inside the chamber fled, the gunman terminated the life of the mute subject before turning to the only living specimen remaining.
Oh yeah, then
He demanded the abomination reveal its identity,
Yeah.
to which it
Then he said
replied,
those famous
Are you? We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free from the depths of your animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds at night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralyze when you slip into the nocturnal realm we cannot tread.
The gunman fired his weapon at the patient's heart, and as the life left its eyes, the subject breathed out the words,
So, nearly free.
one of the most famous dialogues in creepypastas. Ooh. This got me. So yeah, in this second half, coming out I'm not using the term, so I'm just gonna say, yeah, like I said in the last video, it gave me more bit of chills than the first half, so. Especially number 4 and number 4 and then oh yeah, the chanting. I think it was number 7. It was number 7. Of course, I expected Gateway to the Mind and the Russian Experiment to be on this list, but I didn't expect it to be in the top 3. Gateway to the Mind being number 3. Russian Experiment number 1. Well, I kind of saw that one coming because the Russian Experiment is one of the most famous creepypastas out there. So it's been a while since I heard the story. So there was some things I probably didn't remember. I was like, oh, this is new to me. Things I do remember. So like the famous dialogue about how so nearly 3 and we are you. Yeah, that's like the most famous dialogues I've heard out there in the best creepypasta stories on the internet. So, and the Gateway to the Mind, of course, it's like another one that I'm very familiar with. Those were the only 2 I was very familiar with. Some I heard, but they weren't that familiar to me. I probably don't remember that much. As I could recall some of them because I think they were probably in the top 60 non-gaming creepypastas that I react to. Probably, I'm not too sure. I think MKULTRA was. That's why it sounded a bit familiar to me, which is why I don't remember it. But oh boy, like I said in my last video, top videos, you are really good at doing this kind of stuff. Man, you really gave me the chills, though. I'll say that much just too. Like I said in my last video, so that's the only thing I'm going to say about that because I just don't want to repeat what I said in my last video in the last part. So, but overall, what do I think of this top 20s? Pretty good. I totally agree, though. Of course, Russian Sleep Experiment was going to be number 1. I almost thought it wouldn't be number 1, but it's like the most iconic experiment creepypasta out there. So, but yeah, that's all I really have to say, though. Not much I said. I'm sorry. It's kind of like the biggest thing when you're watching almost an hour and a half long top videos. So, kind of the same thing was my. From the last Top videos I reacted to was the non-gaming creepypasta video. So yeah. But in any case, let me know what you guys think about this. Like I said before in my last video. So let me know what you guys think of this. Did you like this? Did you think it's one of the? Did you like this creepypasta video? So let me know in the comment section down below and comment more. Like this video for more reaction videos like this in the future, and for other stuff that I do other than reaction videos in the future. And subscribe to my channel as well. So, and I'm pretty sure I just said that. Damn it. I just redid myself, so. But in any case, for those who are watching this video, thank you for watching. Tune in for more. Like I said again, please subscribe because to my channel. That always makes life happy. And yeah, and that's all for this video. And until next time, 224 Vic is out.